Moscow continues to burn on a daily basis. Its residences, commercial facilities, industrial facilities, military bases, nuclear bases, oil and gas continue to be sabotaged day after day by NATO-backed forces operating there. NATO-backed forces, I mean Ukrainian and partisan saboteurs. This is a civil war in Russia, as Putin said today, and NATO is getting very, very desperate. The reason why you haven't heard about any of this stuff that I talk about on a daily basis is the same reason why they try to suppress the Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin. Now, I don't particularly agree with everything that either of those individuals say, but I will say there is a concerted effort to take attention away from that very thing, and it's a sign that NATO is incredibly desperate. They're desperate, and they're going to do some crazy shit to take attention away from it. When I look at the people who are running the American, no offense to my American friends, I understand we're all being held hostage by the same people. When I think of like the Nancy Pelosi's and the Hillary Clintons, and just compared to a person who's so willing to go into so much depth and give you this historical breakdown and analysis like Vladimir Putin does. Can you imagine any of our politicians going that deep? I mean, we are so shallow here in the West, and our expectations are so low for our leaders. We are the laughing stock of the world, okay? The laughing stock of the world. And I'm very concerned that they're about to do something very, very desperate, because understand there's a reason why we're at war with Russia, and there is a reason why we're giving them so much money. It's, yes, war is a racket. We can all agree on that. But it's also, whether you like it or not, this is the mechanism through which the American empire has expanded. And there is no reverse gear, okay? We can't just become a nation that has ruled now through compromises. It will be seen as a sign of weakness, and it very much might evoke a predatorial instinct in our opponents, because, you know, maybe if we had built an empire on those principles in the first place, then people would respect it. But now they'll see it as a sign of weakness, and people want to get revenge against us, and they will. So we got to keep going until the bitter end, which is fast approaching. So in order to keep China down, you have to keep the one who is empowering China down. And by empowering, I mean fueling them with cheap energy. And that is the Russians, and will be increasingly more so the case in the future. So if you can take down Russia in a civil war, which according to Putin, this war with Ukraine is in fact a civil war. Very interesting. A lot of people might not have missed that, because it was right at the end, his mic drop moment, where he said that he believes that there's going to be reunification with Ukraine. And when that happens, that's what NATO is really worried about. That's what Poland is preparing for. That's what Romania is preparing for. That is why we've been withholding all of the big guns, the big weapons, okay? It's because we don't want them falling into the wrong hands, and we don't particularly trust the Ukrainians either. They're being used, sad to say, to try to diminish Russia's fighting capability, which is why there's so many mercenaries there, which is why the Patriot systems that are there, and a lot of the systems are actually still under the control of mercenary forces or NATO-backed forces, and which is why we've been so reluctant to commit the F-16s and the tanks and the fancier equipment, not necessarily, well, partly because we don't want it to go nuclear, but because we also don't trust. And so because Putin now is in an advantageous position where he appears to be gaining the upper hand in the Ukraine conflict, I do believe that because NATO views this as existential, not only from the Americans' point of view, they could care less if Europe tore itself apart over this. Let's be quite honest about that, okay? I think, unfortunately, Europeans, I mean, if it's not evident already that everybody's out for themselves, and the Americans are no exception to that. And I don't say Americans in terms of the American people. I don't speak in countries in terms of the average Joe. I speak in countries in terms of the leadership, okay? So the Americans actually, in the leadership class, the elite class in the United States, benefit from the Eurozone being essentially monetarily destroyed. And if you can get two of your enemies fighting against each other, because understand, if the Americans weren't the dominating factor in Europe, it would be the Russians. The Russians would likely rule Europe right now if it were not for the Americans, okay? And a lot of Europeans don't want that. They prefer to be ruled by the Americans. They figure that whole model, has its perks, okay? Maybe you get your Nord Stream things blowing up every once in a while, but you still get cool music and, I don't know, you get some other freedoms, and allegedly, until it's time to go to war, then all of those freedoms are removed, and you suddenly find yourself fighting on the front line, with the only perk being they're going to freeze your sperm, but only for 3 years after you die, inevitably in the trenches, as is the case with Ukraine. Now, this is very concerning, because I do think their lack of attention towards what is going on with that interview, and look what they did here, guys. This is not a coincidence. Okay, is it a coincidence that on the same day that Tucker Carlson was scheduled to give this interview, that suddenly this complete non-issue comes out of left field, something to do with Biden leaking classified documents, and all of a sudden, all of the media is questioning Biden's mental health, as if, they just came to this realization in unison. It's like somebody up top just pushed a button and said, okay, it's time to start getting rid of Biden. Tonight was the night that they threw Biden under the bus, that they're getting rid of him. For some reason, they're moving. And look at the juxtaposition of these stories. This is CNN front page. You won't find the Tucker Carlson thing. It's been relegated to the back page. But on the front page, you'll sure see a bunch of this political fluff, sludge bullshit that just makes me, I'm so repulsed by this stuff. Like, I'm so disinterested in this, because it's so fake, it's so cursory. I mean, think about the depth that Vladimir Putin is willing to speak in. I mean, to hear a leader, and then I hear people in the comment section saying, oh, that was a boring 2-hour-long interview. He literally dropped rational, logical, scientific facts for 2 hours, went into great depth, provided context. And you have these ignoramuses who just are bored by it because there's not enough explosions and action-packed sensationalism. I mean, we are fucking done as a society. Let's put it that way. So you have Trump on the one hand, which typically is the ire of CNN. Suddenly, 2 positive stories of Trump on the front page. And this is intentional. This is psychological. And then you have this negative story with Biden. This Biden national address was impromptu, apparently completely unplanned, yet it happened to coincide down to the hour that the release of the Tucker Carlson interview, okay, when the same time that the Tucker Carlson interview was released, that's when Biden went live. You're telling me that's a coincidence? It's not a coincidence. They were clearly trying to divert attention away from that stuff. But again, Trump, how often do you see any positive stories about Trump on CNN? And I'm not a big Trump fan. You guys know that. Like, you will never hear Trump give a 2-hour presentation. He'll give 3 hours. The thing I like about Trump is that, doesn't have a lot of secrets. I mean, I'm sure he's got secrets, but any guy who's willing to just, riff for 3 hours in front of a crowd, I would rather trust that guy than somebody who, you got to get all put together and is all fake and has got to, do the cake face thing and get all prepared in advance. I would rather listen to that, to be brutally honest, because it's just more real, which is not to say I agree with most of what he says either. And if you don't think Trump's going to continue to fund the Ukraine war, you are kidding yourself. He even said in an interview just a few days ago where he said, look, if Europe is going to match the military commitment to NATO, then so will we. But he said it in reference to supplying Ukraine aid. So there's no way in hell this guy is going to end the war on day one. Stop deluding yourself, okay? Anyways, I didn't mean to get all political in this video. I try to be a moderate, but I hope, for you snowflakes out there who are sensitive, you can't say anything about my guy and your guy. I hope I didn't offend you, but if I did, I really don't care at this point. Anyways, so you got 2 positive cases here. How often do you see this? Trump poised to pick up more delegates hours after SCOTUS hearing. Justices signals they may side with Trump in historic case. 2 stories that exalt Trump and one that completely destroys Biden. Biden is gone. He's been thrown under the bus by the establishment. Tonight was the night that the smart people are going to remember where they were when they watched the Tucker Carlson and Putin interview. I will remember that. There's very few moments that they call them flashbulb events. They're so captivating that you remember the setting that you're in when you experience or witness that event. That was one of them. For some people, it's going to be this, okay? For the rest of society, we'll say. People who really are enamored with that kind of nonsense, I pity you. That's all I will say. On the same day, we have Ukraine basically flipping the switch. And interestingly, this guy, if you want to know a little bit of background, this is now the new commander. Everybody said, oh, it's just a rumor. Zelensky's not going anywhere. Well, he's gone. Apparently, he's going to be the ambassador to Britain, so they're jumping ship already. Alexander Silky was born in the Vladimir region, graduated from the Moscow Higher Combined Arms Command School. The parents and the brother of the new commander-in-chief still live in Russia, and his father is a retired colonel of the Russian Armed Forces. You can't make this up. Mind you, a lot of these Ukrainian and Russians apparently went to school together, so this is not a surprise. And, you know, Putin made a point at the end of his interview, kind of a bit of a comment on fratricide, that most of the most vicious wars in history are fought with people who are phenally tied, whether it's the Koreans. It's usually those countries that are right next to each other that get in the most aggressive, vicious wars. Even the United States Civil War is a classic example of that. And this is no different. But he is saying, and I'll read part of it to you because I really encourage you to go back and read the transcript of that interview. When you're sitting in the interview and you're hearing him talk, it's different when you read the transcript just to get a sense of how well-spoken this guy actually is. The endless mobilization in Ukraine, the hysteria, the domestic problems, sooner or later, it will result in an agreement, he says. You know, this probably sounds strange given the current situation. Now think about what he's saying here. This is NATO's fear, right? This is why they're not going all in, because they don't trust the current government there. Remember, this whole thing started with a coup, okay? And there was pro-Russian elements within Ukraine, and I'm not saying all of Ukraine because it's really divided between East and West, but they're concerned that it can flip. And that's what Poland and that's what Romania are for, that's what NATO is for, to eventually go to war with the new post, I don't know what you call it, USSR 2.0 with Russia, Belarus, half of Ukraine, and whoever else. That's what that's for. You know, this probably sounds strange given the current situation, he says, but the relation between two peoples will be rebuilt anyways. And there's historical precedent for this. If you think of after World War II, I mean, how fast Japan and Germany became allies with the West. I mean, they had no choice because the US military obviously took it over and has been there since today. But how quickly harmony arose. But the problem is, when the fundamental mechanism of American expansionism is military domination, you can't just switch to a mode of compromises. And so we cannot exist in a multipolar world. There has to be a winner. People will say, well, we existed in a multipolar world while the USSR and the United States were there, but yeah, that was constantly on edge. We were at the doomsday clock was close to midnight. Constantly, we had all these close brush-ins, close calls. You know, it was just, everybody was worried about nuclear Armageddon constantly. Then the Soviet Union fell, and then we had that peace dividend for a while. You cannot, unfortunately, have a multipolar world within a world, especially in which one of the belligerents has their expansionist model based solely on military superiority and domination of other nations and interventionism. It just will not work. So somebody has to win, is what I'm saying. And how do you get a winner out of this situation? I don't know. Anyways, let me just kind of skip ahead here. He gives an example where Ukrainian soldiers in the Donbass or wherever in the Ukraine theater were encircled. This is an example from real life, and I've heard of this before too. Our soldiers were shouting to them, and I'm thinking this isn't one of those Ghost of Kiev mythologies, but you never know. It could be. Either way, it's a cute story. There is no chance. Our soldiers were shouting to them. The Russian soldiers were shouting to the Ukrainians. There is no chance. Surrender yourselves. Come out and you will be alive. Suddenly, the Ukrainian soldiers were screaming from there in Russian, perfect Russian, saying the following words: Russians don't surrender. And all of them perished. This is because they still identify themselves as Russian. What is happening is, to a certain extent, an element of civil war. Everyone in the West thinks that the Russian people have been split by hostilities forever, and now they will be reunited. The unity is still there. Why are the Ukrainian authorities dismantling the Ukrainian Orthodox Church? Because it brings together not only the territory, it brings together our souls. So there's a, kind of trying to appeal to people's Christian interests there. But this makes me think that if the Russians drop a nuke, if that's how they genuinely feel about Ukraine, or at least part of Ukraine, not the Polish part of Ukraine, if they drop a nuke, it's going to be on Nato. This could be the reason that's preventing them from doing it in the first place. And I think what is definitely going to come first will be a demonstrative nuclear demonstration. Now, Putin routinely plays down the idea that they're ever going to use nuclear weapons, and they're saying that this hysteria about World War III and nuclear weapons is all a concoction by the West, and nonetheless, they continue to rapidly advance their strategic arsenal in way more ways than we have, at least in ways that we've been disclosing. They have 6 new sophisticated weapon platforms for which we have no equivalent. They have a greater interest in electromagnetic pulse weapons, hypersonic weapons, nuclear torpedoes, all kinds of nuclear innovations. Of course, they say it's just for deterrence. But Putin is very intelligent, and what concerns me also is how confident he is about, even in spite of the fact that I can show you videos like this every single day where Moscow is burning down and these acts of sabotage are being committed, and it seems as though Russia's back is up against the wall. This guy continues with that grin on his face as if he knows what the end result of this is going to be, and that he's willing to watch his nation burn day after day, and as if there's like a certain, that they're willing to let half their country burn. I'm convinced at this point in time, before they really view this as an existential crisis. When you think about what's in the Russian DNA, in that the Germans were how far outside of the capital and things got turned around, so I think to them, they're just getting started. As they've said, they just have this mindset of, you haven't seen anything. You can burn down, countless amounts of buildings, and we're not going to go there yet. But this is why I think that it's going to prompt NATO to do some crazy shit. Now, that bill just passed the Senate, I do believe, and now I guess it's on the way to the House. Is that how it works? And so I guess we'll see. They're trying to push it through, but I get the sneaking suspicion, the fact that they're so scared of Putin, they're scared of him because he's smart. And he is probably one of the smartest leaders. I'm not saying he's a person who I worship or envy in any sort of way, or put on a pedestal in any sort of way. But in terms, as far as our political leadership goes, the guy is up there. He's got a high IQ, and he uses it, and he's sharp, and that's something we don't have here. Okay, we have a cabal of people who is telling somebody what document to sign on a daily basis, and just trying to make sure that they can give the speech that they're supposed to give without having too many gaffes. So, I was going to go through and break down the speech one by one, but I don't even really see the point of that, because there's people who are much better at doing that sort of thing. I mean, I do have some notes that I laid out here, some things that I pulled apart. I mean, he talked about denazification. Lots of his demands were very vague, which is also concerning in that he's saying one thing, but you can't believe everything he is saying, okay? Because he's very skilled in the art of deception as well, being a former KGB agent. So I'm not naive to the fact that he doesn't have his own agenda as well, and maybe he's just grinning from ear to ear because he knows that the collapse of the West is inevitable, and it's happening at this point, and that basically we're going down, and it's going to be in our best interest to make some sort of compromise, but we can't compromise because our whole petrodollar system is based on subjugating lesser nations and basically keeping a good chunk of the world impoverished because unfortunately we don't benefit. Our system is not set up so that we benefit from other people's prosperity. That's a complicated conversation, but it's unfortunately the truth. It reaches a point when other people's prosperity becomes a risk factor for our system. He talks about whether or not they have imperialist ambitions. He denies that. He downplays the risk of nuclear war, as is to be expected. You're never going to hear him. And, you know, interestingly, just the amount of discipline that he has, like he repeatedly would say things like, I don't want to disclose the contents of my personal conversations with Joe Biden, like still having that level of decorum and respect for your adversary is just a degree of professionalism in this political game that our leadership class just doesn't possess anymore. I mean, the fact that he's willing to withhold his true feelings about certain leaders and still remain professional even though somebody is trying to destroy you and potentially kill you, I mean, that says a lot. And the West can't handle a person like that. The West can handle a very aggressive person or a very weak person. That's what they want. They want somebody that they can manipulate, somebody who acts on emotion, not somebody stoic like that who is just like a computer, okay, and is just trying to make the absolute most efficient decision in any situation. That's what Putin is trying to do. He did say something, and this is kind of a giveaway and it's a contradiction, and there are numerous contradictions. One of them was that he said in the past that he doesn't care if certain soldiers go into the western portion of Ukraine. Well, today, Tucker asked him about the Chuck Schumer comment about how U.S. soldiers are going to have to go into Ukraine if Ukraine begins to fall. And he says, Vladimir Putin responds by saying, this is a provocation and a cheap provocation at that. I do not understand why American soldiers should fight in Ukraine. They are mercenaries from the United States. The bigger number of mercenaries comes, of course, from Poland, and then with mercenaries from the United States coming in second. If nobody has the desire to send regular troops, that would certainly, however, he says, if somebody has the desire to send regular troops, that would certainly bring humanity to the brink of a very serious global conflict. That is obvious. So he does admit that NATO soldiers within Ukraine will escalate the conflict to a global level. So that is somewhat at odds with explicit statements that he's made in the past that have welcomed in Poland and Romania to take up the chunks of Ukraine that they want, Hungary or whatever, and split it up as they see fit. And he's kind of made some implicit suggestions towards that end in today's video. But he also makes the comment of thousands of miles away from your national territory. Why would you want to fight? Don't you have anything better to do? You have issues on the border, issues with migration, issues with national debt, more than 33 trillion. You have nothing better to do, so you should fight in Ukraine. And while I agree on the surface, that sounds sensible and reasonable. However, again, you need to understand the big picture here, okay? A lot of this is to do with keeping the Russians suppressed for now so they don't infringe on that sphere of influence in Europe, start messing with the U.S. money in that situation, which of course what Nord Stream was going to be. And these people are very greedy. They're rapacious and they're insatiable. Rapaciously insatiable, as I usually say. And Putin did check Tucker on China. One thing you'll find is that typically a lot of people who are, for some reason, sympathetic to the Russian cause are still pretty gung-ho about going to war with Iran or China or one or the other. Like, there's still, like, everybody has their nemesis, it seems, depending on which side of the political spectrum they originate in. I'm not sure if it's racially motivated or what. Some people, you know, just got it in for the Iranians. Some people got it in for the Chinese. Some people absolutely can't stand the Russians. But he did check them on Tucker's comment about China. Tucker said that, don't you think that BRICS, the BRICS organization, which is basically kind of like a monetary alliance, an economic alliance of Brazil, China, India, South Africa, and Russia. Those are the key five, but there's many more members that have joined. He said, don't you think there's a risk of China completely dominating BRICS? Shouldn't you worry about that? So trying to signify that, shouldn't you worry about the Chinese, right? Because there's definitely a certain part of the U.S. political class that would like to use Russia as a battering ram against China, okay? And Putin has extended the invitation for them to enter NATO in the past, but they've declined that option. I think he brought something up about that with Bill Clinton. Anyways, he says, while we've heard those boogeyman stories before, it is a boogeyman story. We're neighbors with China. You cannot choose your neighbors, just like you cannot choose close relatives. Second, we have centuries-long histories of coexistence. We're used to it. Third, China's foreign policy philosophy is not aggressive. The idea is to always look for compromise, a word that's just not in our vocabulary, unfortunately. Anyways, as for that explosion yesterday that I talked about at the nuclear weapons manufacturing facility, apparently there was a planned test, but something didn't go according to plan, and there were several people who were injured, possibly some of them who died, and yeah, it was not good. So either way, you cannot trust that any of these things are accidental. I mean, look at this fire jumping from rooftop to rooftop. I don't know if that's something about the way they design their apartment buildings, but that seems a little strange. Anyways, guys, that's about all I got for you tonight. Check in tomorrow because we have a very special guest coming back on the channel once again. And it's all about, you guessed it, World War III and the lesser known aspects of nuclear Armageddon. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.